Today's daf is daf Chav Ches, and we're in the middle of the brisa that we started yesterday on daf Chav Zayin Amid Beis and continued on to Chav Ches Amid Aleph, and we're up to Yochel. And this would be approximately 10 lines down from the top. The brisa is continuing in the Shaklavitaria of trying to determine if a person set aside a carbon and now he wants to use it for a different chiyuv carbon. Yochel, I might think, shelo yetze b'behema shehifish li atzmo min hakala ala kala o min hachamura ala chamura afilu min hakala ala chamura o min hachamura ala kala. The brisa says, Yochel, we might entertain the following havamina, that if a person was mafresh a carbon for a certain sin, and now he wants to use that same carbon for a different sin, a different chiyuv, kares b'mezid chiyuv chatas b'shogeg, and perhaps that would only apply if he was mafresh a behema for himself, and even if he has two averos, each of which is mechayev a karban chatas, he cannot fulfill his second chiyuv with that karban chatas that he was mafresh for the first avera, for the first chet. And let's say the two chatoim are exactly equal. For example, a kala ala kala, like dam on chelev, or min hachamura ala chamura, or for one chil Shabbos and another chil Shabbos, both averos are on the same level. And afilu, how much more so, min hakala ala chamura, min hachamura ala kala, if the two averos are not shavos, one, the first, let's say, is a kala, and the second one is a chamura, or the opposite. And I might think that in that particular scenario where he wants to use his carbon for a different chet, shekain, we have a precedent as to why he cannot do so. And that is that, as we saw in the brisa, this we saw earlier in the brisa, hifrish behema ala chelev, vehevi al adam, or if he was mafresh a chatas al adam vehevi ala chelev, he's not yotzi yedei chovaso. Even though achilas dam and achilas chelev are shavos, they're both averos kalos that only reach the level of kares and not misas bezdin. And the reason he cannot use the karban chatos for dam on behalf of his chiyuv for chelev or vice versa is sharei lo mal, because the carbon retains its kedusha, and that's the halach of kedusha guf, and that means that me'ilah, even if he would violate the isur me'ilah, the behema, the animal, would not be yotzeis lechulin, and that's called lo mal. Lo mal here has nothing to do with the violation of the isur as much as it has to do with whether the behemas hegdesh is yotzei lechulin. But we're talking about now Kedushas Haguf, and Kedushas Haguf does not go lechulin, only Kedushas Damin. So he was motzi from one hegdish to another hegdish, but it's not yotzei lechulin, it's Kedushas Haguf. And therefore, lo keeper, now we understand why. If he has a krova of a behema in a case of shoging on one sin, he cannot use that behema as a chatos to be mechaper for another sin. And we're going to derive from this that if he was mafresh a chatos for one sin, and now he deliberately wants to bring that chatos for another sin, he's not yotzei. And that means that a person cannot be yotzei de chovaso unless this behema that was mafresh was for this particular avera. Now that's all in the case of hafrasha of a behema. Now we move on to another case of hafrosh of mos. Aval yotze b'mos shifresh liatzman akal l'kal v'nechamura chumul v'nechamura l'kal v'nekal l'chamura. However, if he designated mos, not a behema, for his own sin, he can now, in this habamina, change the mos and use them to buy a behemoth's chatos for another sin. And that applies whether or not both sins are equal, they're both kalos or chamuros. And the reason for this is because it's not in a behemoth, and the behemoth itself is inherently designated for one sin, you can't use it for another sin, but now we're talking about mos. Mos has a more generic kind of status to it. And the Gemara is asking now, what about if the averos are not shavos? Let's say ben achamura l'kal v'nekal l'chamura, he was mafresh mos up front for an avera chamura, and then he wants to buy a carbon for an avera kala, or the other way around. Is in such a case, shekain, we found already, shekain means motzinu kvar, that a person could be yotze yidei chavos b'mos when he was mafresh for one sin, and he now designates or redirects the mos to buy a chatos for another sin. And we saw it in the Brisa, Shem Hifrish li'atzmo mos min ha'chelev. The mos were designated for chatos for the violation of chelev, vehevi al hadam, and instead he used these mos to buy a chatos for achilas dam, or the other way around, he designated his mos for chatos for al adam vehevi al hachelev. In this case, he can be yotze. Why? As opposed to behema, which has kedushas haguf, and therefore there's no meila, and therefore it's not yotze l'chulin. But in the case of mos doesn't have kedushas haguf. Mos are not brought on the mizbeach, and all the highest level of kedusha that you could impose upon mos is only kedushas damim, sharei mal, and therefore if he redesignates the mos by violating the Isser Me'ila, and the mos had, let's say, a kedusha kala of kedushas damim, therefore through his Me'ila it's yosei l'chulin v'chiper, and therefore he can be mechaper, he can achieve his kapara if he was makriv from these same mos b'shogeg on a different sin, because a shinui michet echad lechet acher is chal even for me'ila, to generate a me'ila, which in the case of kedushas damim is mafkia the kedusha, and it's yotzei l'chulin. So now the Gemara, the Brisa stipulates a havamina that even lechatchila you'd be allowed to change the mos from chatos for one avera to chatos on another avera. Talmud Lomar, and here we have another pasuk and another miut. It says v'chiper olav hakohen al chatoso asher chatam v'nislach lo. And we're going to darshan from the words al chatoso that he's not yotzi yidei chovaso ache karbono l'shem cheto, that he should be mafresh the carbon for the purpose of this chet for which he's bringing the chatos, and not for another chet. And that we saw already, that if he was mafresh a behema for one chet, he cannot use it to be yotzi yidei chovaso for another chet. And that we derive from the pasuk vehevi karbano siras izim tmima nekeva al chatosa shel chata. And this pasuk is going to also teach us mos, and this is the end of the brisa. Now, this very long brisa that is almost a full daf Gemara, was brought for what purpose? Now we have to backtrack, rewind, and remember what we were coming for. Rava was the one who quoted this long brisa in his objection against Rav Nachman. Rav Nachman on Daf Chav Zayin had formulated the opinion that just like in Mos, we have a halacha l'Moshe Sinai, that Mos Stumin is Yiplu le'olas nidam. So if you have Mos Stumin that weren't designated specifically for a chatos, but there's a chatos mixed in this whole taroves, then you can, if let's say the Bala Karban dies, you can redirect these Mos Stumin and use them for an Olas Nidam. Rav Nachman said that I have another case that's similar to Mos, and that's Behema Balas Mum. Why? Because a Behemas Balas Mum, as we discussed yesterday, you don't have to wait and delay until it gets a mum before you can sell it. It already has a mum. So it's like Mos. It's over lasocher. Immediately you can sell it. So Rava is now going to be medayik from our brisa that Rav Nachman is not correct, because the brisa is not it does not distinguish between one behema and another behema, between a tmima and a balas mum. Ketani mias behema. The brisa mentions that if the Nazir was mafrish a behema for his own karbanos, and then he dies, and his son wants to bring those karbanos for his own, meaning the son's own naziris, he cannot do so. But in a case of Mos Stumin, where we have halacha l'Moshe Sinai, there is a scenario in which the ben could take his father's Mos that were designated for his father's karbanos nazirus and use those Mos to purchase his own karbanos nazirus. And the reason for that is because of the halacha of Mos Stumin, that the father in his lifetime did not say that these specific Mos are for a chatos. My love, l'chora, this din that a son could not take the behema of his father and use it for his own karbanos nazirus would apply straight across the board, whether it's a behema tmima or afilu balas mum. So we're going to derive from this that a behema balas mum is not stuma, but rather mefureshes. And it's not like Mos, which we said are stumos. In the case of behema, we're not going to apply the halacha Moshe Sinai and allow the son to bring that behema of his father's designation for naziris for his own naziris. It means that a behema is not included in halacha Moshe Sinai. The latter was only referring to Mos Stumin. And now Rav is going to make the following analogy, that just like with regard to this halacha, that if a ben wants to use his father's designation for his own nazirus, then he can do so only in Mos Stumos, but not in the case of a behema. Neither a tmima nor a balas mum. Is therefore the same thing should apply with regard to the halacha Moshe Sinai, that Mos Stumin, which we can now redirect to a nedava, but a behemas balas mum is not like Mos Stumin. And instead of going to nedava, it has the status of mefureshes and it goes lemisa. And therefore, we have an objection now against Rav Nachman, who says that a balas mum has the din of a stuma, and the Gemara rejects this low tmima. That the din of this price that the ben cannot use his father's karbanos for his own nazirus, when his father was mafresh those karbanos in his lifetime, and then he died, that applies only in the case of a tmima. A tmima is like mefureshes because it's very challenging to sell it until it gets a mum, and therefore it's not included in the halacha Moshe Sinai of Mos. But in the case of I should be more specific here and say that it's not included in Halacha Moshe Sinai of the son being Megalech on the Nazirus of his father. But if it would be a Balas Mum, then Enochinami, we're going to accept Rav Nachman, and it's Kistuma. And it's included in Halacha Moshe Sinai. And the Ben could bring those behemos for his Nazirus. Obviously, he can't bring a behema Balas Mum on the Mizbeach, but he could sell it and redirect those mos for his Karbonis Nazirus. So the halacha Moshe Sinai that mos stumin on nofel v'nedava applies equally to a behema Balas Mum, and she has the status of stuma. So Gemara asks about Balas Mum, my kistuma dami is my area diktani. Listening Balas Mum. Why does the Brisa limit itself to a discussion about the father who designated Mos, and then after his death, the son could use these Mos for his own Karbonos Nazir? Why doesn't it mention a Behema? Why does the Brisa limit itself to Mos? You'll tell me in a Behema it's like Mefurashos. But according to Rav Nachman, in the case of a behema that's a Balas Mum, then it has the status of a stuma, and therefore the son could bring that behema not on the Mizbeach, but he can direct it towards his own Karbonos Nazirus. So the Gemara answers Achinami. That's what the din is. And the Tana could have written the din of a behemoth's Balas Mum, and not just the case of Mos. Dilumai Chazio Lidami is Demei Hainu Mos. There's no need for the Brisa to mention a Behema Balas Mum. A Behemoth's Balas Mum is virtually dummy. Because what do you do with the Behemoth's Balas Mum? There's nothing else you can do with it but sell it, and to buy with its dummy make carbon. So therefore, it's dummy. Hainu Mos. It's exactly included in the word Mos. The word Mos, semantically, according to the halacha, includes a behema Balas Mum. And this leads us to the Mishnah here on the bottom of Daf Chav Ches Amud Aleph. The previous Mishnah had already clarified that a Baal could be made for the Nazirus of his wife. And now this Mishnah is going to give us a limitation. A married woman, was mekabelas al atzma nazirus. She completes her nazirus b'tara, and now she brings her korbanos, the chatos, the ola, and the shlomim, with the siyum of her nazirus. V'nizrak alea echad min adamin, and the Kohen was already zorek the dam of one of these three karbanos. Eino yachal afer, it's too late for the Baal to be meifir. And what this means is, and we're explaining now the Tanakama, is that it's no longer considered inui nefesh. It's out of the parameters of the hafaras habal. And why is this? Because as we're going to see in a later Mishnah, once there's rikas dam of one of the three karbanos, that already removes the Nazirus in such a way that now the Nazir is allowed to drink wine, he's allowed to be mitami lemesim, and he hasn't yet done his tiglachas yet. But despite that fact, he's allowed to drink wine and be mitami lemesim. So if that be the case, then we're out of the purview of hafaras haba or hafaras ha'av. Hafaras haba. Why? Because once there was a zrikas adam of one of the karbanos, and now she's allowed to drink wine and be mitami lemesim, now the Nazirus is no longer defined as inui nefesh. And the Baal's power of hafara is only with regard to nidarim sheish b'hem inui nefesh, as we learned in Masechet nidarim. However, if there was no zrikas adam, even if the karbanos were nishchetu, they were already shechted, the Baal could still be Mayfair the Nazirus of his wife, because until the Zrikas Adam, there's a short period of time in which she's still Asura, she's not allowed to drink wine, not allowed to enter into a cemetery, and that's considered a neder of Ini Nefesh. So that's the Tanakhama's Shita. And just to summarize, the Tanakhama is saying that once there was a Zrika of one of the Damin, and that's going to be Matir, Hashtias, Yayin, and Tumul Ames, therefore it's no longer Ini Nefesh, the Baal can no longer be made for Hanaziris. And Rabbi Akiva now is going to push it up, meaning we don't even have to wait until Zrika. Afilu nishketu aleh achas mikol behemos, eno yochel lahafer. Once one of the three of these karbanos were shechted, that's already the end and the termination of the Baal's authority to be made for Nazirus. And this has to do with a concept called bizayon kodshim. Because once there was the shechita, if now the Baal is going to be made for his wife's Nazirus, that korban is pasul legamri. And that's called bizayon kodshim, or hefsed kodshim. Now the Mishnah goes back to discuss situations of inui nefesh after zrikas adam. But when do we say the Baal can no longer be made for a Nazirus? After zrikas adam, as we saw in the Tanakhama of our Mishnah. That's only v'tiglacha satara. That means she completed her Nazirus b'tara. She brought her karbanos for the siyum hanazirus. The Baal can no longer be made for his wife's Nazirus after zrikas adam because she's already mutaris b'yayin, and there's no ini nefesh aval b'tiglachas atuma, where she's going to need another 30 days of Nazirus. So she contracted tumah in the middle of her Nazirus. Now she's bringing the karbanos of a Nazir Tomei, and as a result of her purification, after her Tara is completed, then she'll have to start again anew, counting Yemei Nazirus, Yafa, the Baal can be Mefer. Because now, even if there was already Zrikas Adam, it still is Inui Nefesh. Why? I'm not interested in being together with a woman who's menuveles, meaning she's in a state of nazirus. She's not allowed to drink wine. She's not allowed to be metamel mason. She's not allowed to cut her hair. And this is all because of the second round of nazirus that she'll have to begin after her tara from the tumah is completed. But Rebbe Omer, or according to one girsa, it is Rabbi Meir Omer, af b'tiglachas hatara, even in the case where she completed on Nazirus b'tara, and there was a Zrikas Adam, Yofer, the Baal could still be made for Hanadarm. Why? I mean, she's already Muteris b'yayin, there's no Yidin Nefesh. And the answer is, says Rabbi Meir, Shu Yochel Lomar Efshi Be'isha Migalachas. I don't want my wife to have to go through Giluach and completely shave off all the hairs, and that's Minuval. I don't want to be married to such a woman. And if I'm not made for her Nazirus, then she'll have to cut off all her hair, but see my Nazirus. You'll ask me, Shikwer Shaitel. Okay, the Gemara is going to ask that question. So Gemara says, Masnisa, in our Mishnah that says that immediately after Zrika Saddam, according to Tanakhama, even if there was only Zrika of one of the three karbanos, and even though she wasn't Megalech yet, the Baal cannot be made for Nazirus because she's already Muteris B'yayin. And that's called, and it's no longer, Inui Nefesh. So the Gemara says that's against Rabbi Eliezer. The low Rabbi Eliezer, the Rabbi Eliezer or Omar, Rabbi Eliezer later on at Daf Mem Vav is of the opinion that Tiglachas Ma'keves, that if a Nazir at the end of his Nazirus has not yet undergone Tiglachas, then he still remains Osir B'yayin. And therefore, in our Mishnah, the Kevan Shalo Gilcha, she has not yet cut off her hair, even though, again, there was a Zrikas Hadam of one of the Damim, is Asir B'chamer. She cannot drink wine, according to Rabbi Eliezer, because you need the Tiglachas at the end of the Nazirus to be Mater Yain, and that's Likuva. Since we still have a situation where she's Asur B'Yayin, and that's considered a Nefesh, and during that period of time until she does the Tiglachas, she's Asur B'Yayin, is therefore the Baal could still be made for her Nazirus, even after Zrikas Hadam, because she hasn't yet undergone the process of Tiglachas. And at this point, the Gemara is going to explain the machlokes here in our Mishnah between the Tanakama and Rabbi Akiva.